so what we're going to talk about now is the somatic nervous system. And just to refresh ourselves, the peripheral nervous system had two main divisions, the autonomic and the somatic. The autonomic we had no control over. The somatic nervous system is where we have control. And the effective tissue here is your skeletal muscle. This is the only tissue, or the only muscle tissue that we have voluntary control over. Okay. So let's start by looking at the anatomy of the somatic nervous system. First of all, we have only motor neurons and only one motor neuron. How many neurons did we have in the autonomic nervous system? And what were they called? How many neurons did we have in the autonomic nervous system? So in the autonomic nervous system, we had two neurons, not motor neurons, sorry. Two neurons, the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron, right? In the somatic nervous system, we have a single neuron and it's a motor neuron. Now it's gonna originate from the ventral horn, right, which is this area of the spinal cord. Again, if we took a cross section of the spinal cord, we have our ventral horn, lateral horn, dorsal horn. The fibers of the autonomic division came from the lateral horn, whereas fibers of the somatic division are coming from the ventral horn. Okay? They're also exiting through the ventral root, which we also saw with the autonomic nervous system. Now, the only neurotransmitter here is acetylcholine, so there is no epinephrine or norepinephrine involved in the somatic nervous system. And as a result, the only receptor that we encounter is a nicotinic cholinergic receptor. So no adrenergic receptors here, no muscarinic receptors here. Only acetylcholine, only nicotinic cholinergic receptors. And what type of receptors are nicotinic cholinergic in terms of their speed? Ionotropic, right? So these are the receptors that also act as a channel and are going to quickly depolarize the muscle tissue. We'll see how that happens in a little bit. Okay, so let's look at a motor unit. Now, a motor unit, by definition, is a single motor neuron and all the muscle fibers that it innervates. So the question we saw earlier asked about how many fibers were innervated by a single motor neuron, and the answer was many. And that's because one motor neuron has many axon terminals that are going to innervate several different muscle fibers, okay? But if we took a single muscle fiber, it can only be innervated by one motor neuron, right? And again, the only tissue that is affected in the somatic nervous system is skeletal muscle. And if we look at this muscle, so if you took this as an entire muscle belly or muscle, the bulk of the muscle, there are several different muscle fibers that make up this muscle belly. So a single muscle fiber is synonymous to a muscle cell. We'll talk about that when we look at the structure of muscle in muscle physiology. But in terms of understanding the somatic nervous system here, one motor neuron, so you have a motor neuron, let's take this one in blue. This is motor neuron 1, has 3 or 4 different axon terminals, which are synapsing onto several different muscle fibers. But if we took this one muscle fiber, let's take this one in blue, it can only receive innervation from motor neuron 1. So it cannot get innervation from motor neuron 1 and motor neuron 2 and motor neuron 3. It will only have contact with one motor neuron, or the axon terminal of one motor neuron. Okay? So as a result, one motor neuron innervates many muscle fibers, but a single muscle fiber can only be innervated by one motor neuron. Let's talk about the neuromuscular junction now. So the neuromuscular junction is the area where a motor neuron innervates a muscle tissue, a muscle fiber specifically. Now, the activities on the motor neuron side is that we have IPSPs and EPSPs that are arriving on the cell body of this motor neuron. So let's say this is our motor neuron. We had several synapses coming onto the cell body of this motor neuron. We had several different graded potentials. So we had EPSPs and IPSPs, and depending on how they summed, depending on the overall potential onto this cell body. That would determine, again, at the axon hillock, when they sum at the axon hillock, this is called neural integration. We talked about this before. This would determine whether or not this motor neuron fires an action potential, okay? If it does fire an action potential, it's going to travel down the length of this neuron, down the axon. It's going to arrive at the end plates, or the nerve terminal, the axon terminal, and it's going to trigger the release of acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. Acetylcholine will then travel across the cleft and arrive onto that muscle fiber. Okay. Let's look at what happens on the muscle side. Now, the terminal bouton, also called the axon terminal, after releasing that acetylcholine into the neuromuscular junction, it's going to travel across the synaptic cleft and bind onto those nicotinic cholinergic receptors. Now, if you remember, these receptors are ionotropic, so they're only going to allow, they are going to allow the neurotransmitter to bind, and then they're going to allow the movement of ions, because the receptors also acting as a channel. And the movement of those ions will then depolarize the membrane here, depolarize the muscle fiber cell, which would excite that muscle and result in what we call an end plate potential. So an end plate potential is the excitation of the muscle fiber, which allows the muscle to contract. Now, important to mention is that the synapse, the neuromuscular junction, the synapse here is always excitatory. So from the nerve terminal over to the muscle fiber, this can only be an excitatory action. And when it does excite, the muscle will contract. Okay. There's also the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, and we're going to talk about how